Thank you. And now,
It's always a pleasure to be here and speak to you people, even though the things I have to speak about aren't always encouraging in the immediate short-term view of it. Because you people are the children of God who want to know what your Father's will is and then to live according to it. Now, it's no news to you that we have reached the point, we are in the times of the end, in the last days. We are at the point where we can already see the rapid approach of the complete collapse of our civilization. Oh yeah, I've got no optimistic message that if you just shut your eyes it'll all go away. It won't. We've shut our eyes for so many generations, we're going to have to open them and face the facts. We are at the point of the collapse and destruction of our civilization, which is not our misfortune, but taking us collectively as a nation, our fault. Because there is no evil being done to us today that we did not permit. We have been betrayed by our leaders, and not the least of those in this corrupt betrayal have been those in the organized church system who have led the betrayal. Somebody once asked Satan, well, what are you going to do when you run up against a great truth which is so clear and plain you can't refute it and you can't twist it? Oh, he said, I'll organize it. That's the way it's happened. We've let Satan do the organizing, and you see where we're coming to. We see ourselves threatened today not by one dangerous evil, but by many. They're all coming together at once, just like the spokes of a wheel. They start out at different points in the rim and they run in different directions, but they all come together at the same place, at the hub. They are all part of the Babylonian system which we were warned to get out of. Come out of her, my people, lest ye be partakers of her sins and suffer your part in her plagues. So today I want to talk to you about Babylon's money. The enemy, the children of Satan, has tried repeatedly in the past to overcome and destroy us by force, by military attack. And he's always failed because there were enough of us true to our God that God always came to our defense and destroyed the enemy army. But they have learned this. If they can once get control of the money system, they can enslave you more completely than they could by military force, and what's more, they can make you pay the cost of your own enslavement. They don't even have to raise a penny of it out of their own pocket. The liberals have preached to us for a long time that the only function of government is to tax its unfortunate citizens into such a state of destitution that they all become dependent on the government for a handout for their living, so then they can be sternly warned, unless you vote this same administration back in power, your welfare check's going to be cut down. Perpetuate your own slavery. The other function of the government of maintaining peace should, of course, be abdicated in favor of allowing riots to go on, because the rioters provide one of those minority groups that help to rule the majority. But I tell you that one of the most important functions of government is the issuance of money. Now, all the money there was in the original 13 colonies wouldn't be nearly enough to carry on the daily business of your one city of Bellflower today. As our nation expands, more people carrying on more business and all that, it becomes necessary to have more money in circulation with which to do it. One of the great economists of our day, Taussig of Harvard, states the quantity theory of money in this way. If it is to function as money, as a medium of exchange, which it's supposed to do, there must be in existence, in circulation, $1 in money for every dollar's worth of property of any kind capable of being purchased with money. You are a homeowner who may someday want to sell your home, and you can't sell it unless there's a money someplace to buy it from you with. You're a merchant with a big well-stocked store, and you can't sell an article in it unless there's the money in existence in somebody's hands with which you can come and buy your products, and so forth. We have a modest part of 1% of enough money to meet that test, which has compelled us, for lack of money, to do business on bank credit, which costs us in interest. Now, I'm not making a general attack upon your local banker, for the reason that, in allowing the Babylonian economic system to take us over, we have made the bank a necessity. If we were under the laws of God, we wouldn't need as big a police force as we need now. I believe we ought to be under the laws of God. I don't go around crusading to fire half the police force now. I only wish we had more police, as long as we insist on staying under the Babylonian system instead of God's law. So I'm not conducting a crusade to abolish your local banking system, because you can't do it until you set up God's economic system complete. If you've got $1 in money, you can spend 100 cents of it. And if you have to go and borrow it, you probably can spend only 93 cents of it, because you're paying probably 7% interest. And today they take out the interest in advance before they let you have the money. Which means, therefore, that you can put less and less money back in circulation. It's not merely that your purchases are cut down, but since you can't spend as much, the merchant can't sell as much, he can't hire more employees, he can't pay more wages or higher wages, and so the thing runs in a vicious circle. Now, that is merely the minor part of it. Your local bank starts with so many $1 million paid in capital by people who buy shares of stock in it. They've got that much money to lend out. Then the depositors put their money in the bank, and the bank has that money to lend out. And they have discovered by long generations of experience that a bank can lend many times more dollars than it has. In other words, they will average at least $10 loaned out for each $1 they actually have. And the reason is that very few people ask for their money in cash. You go to the bank and borrow $1,000, and they don't count you out $100 bills. They give you a little passbook with the figure 1,000 written in it. And you draw a check as a down payment on a TV set, and you draw a check for a new set of tires and so on. And the merchants don't take those checks in and get cash. They just deposit them in the bank. And all the bank does is make changing entries in the books. They subtract from your account the amount of these checks, and they add it to the account of the merchants who deposited it, and they haven't had to pay out any cash. Now, once in a while you go to the bank and you cash a $25 check for pocket money, and as I say, 1/10 of the amount that the bank is lending out is sufficient to take care of all of that. But eventually there reaches a point when the bank has loaned out $10 for every dollar it has. And the process would have to come to a halt if there wasn't somebody to backstop them. The bank ought to be able to take the mortgage on your home, which is a perfectly good security, to somebody else and sell it to them and get some more money with which the bank can function as a bank. Now, that is the theory upon which a larger organization, the Federal Reserve Bank system, was organized. But the trouble with theory is merely the old one, that figures don't lie, but liars do figure. They don't run it according to theory. It gives to this central organization the Federal Reserve Bank system, which is falsely named because it's not federal at all, it's a purely private banking institution. It gives them the absolute power in their uncontrolled discretion to create panics and depressions anytime they see fit by just shutting off the supply of money. They shut down all activities of the banks. Now, as you know, most merchants, when they need to buy a new stock in trade, don't have enough cash to buy it themselves. They finance it through the bank. Lots of farmers need a loan each year to tide them through the period till their crops go to market. So these things have to have bank credit, and the Federal Reserve Bank system has repeatedly brought disaster upon us. The way so many farmers were wiped out and the small town banks wiped out in 1921 by the deliberate and knowing action of the Federal Reserve Bank in bringing it about. The way they again brought about the great crash in 1929, being examples of this. That is a power which no man should possess, but was given to them. But now we're getting to the next step, which is the worst of all. Each year, our nation and its business should be expanding. And therefore, with more business to be conducted, more money needed. Now, when you don't have enough money on which to conduct the present setup, and all your government does is extort from the unfortunate taxpayers too big a share of the insufficient amount we already have, your government is not doing anything to help the situation. Your government is making it worse. What the government should be doing is to be constantly issuing more money to keep up with the expanding needs of the nation's economy. Now let's suppose, in order to keep our figures simpler, instead of a $180 billion budget for the coming year, as President Johnson wants, let's call it $100 billion. And let's suppose that the experts in the Department of Commerce figured out that the coming year, to keep business humming on a level of prosperity for everybody, there should be $15 billion more money in circulation than there is now. The government would then issue $15 billion in new money, which the government would use to pay governmental expenses with. That would leave only $85 billion to be raised by taxing you people for it. The government, between the new money issued and the taxes they bring in, would get the amount it needs. But instead of you being taxed out of $100 billion, you'd be taxed out of only 85, and you taxpayers collectively would have $15 billion of your own money left. Part of it you could put in savings so that you won't be a pauper, destitute, depending on a government handout merely to eat in your old age. Part of it you could spend for the things you cannot now afford, and by your spending it, you would help to bring circulating money and prosperity to the nation. Now, that's the way it ought to be, and that's the way it is not. Because corrupt men with corrupt purposes corrupted the law, and it hasn't been possible to change it since. I don't have to start in at the beginning and explain to you who the devil's children are. You know that already. One of them came over here in 1902. He was Paul M. Warburg, a German citizen, a member of the German banking family who had the house of M.M. Warburg Company. They were a big German banking firm with headquarters in Hamburg and in Amsterdam, and they were the chief German representatives of the House of Rothschild. Now, this Jew came over here from Germany, and he never did learn to speak English very well, but he came over here to tell us how to run our money system. Not for our profit, but for his. And he succeeded in getting through Congress the Federal Reserve Bank Act in 1913. Now, in 1912, with the money put up by the members of the Jewish banking firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, a Marano Jew calling himself Woodrow Wilson was elected President of the United States. When the family lived in Germany and were openly Jewish, they spelled the name Wolfson, W-O-L-F-S-O-N. When they moved to England, they followed the Jewish custom of altering the name occasionally, and it became Wolson, W-O-H-L-S-O-N. And when they moved to the United States, it became Wilson. As Democratic politicians always do, he was in as the representative of the people against the great interests, the great financial interests. And of course, he was their hireling. They owned him like you own your dog, and he came to heel just as obediently. And he helped them get through the Federal Reserve Bank Act. First, they tried to set up one central bank for the United States. Well, we'd fought that off a couple of times. We fought it off in the early days. Andrew Jackson succeeded in defeating that once, and we fought it off again in Civil War days. So they finally went through the formality of setting up a system of 12 of these banks in 12 of the major cities of the United States, but the only one of them that has much money available is the New York Federal Reserve Bank. So New York runs your money system. As you know, there are more Jews in New York than there are in Palestine. Now, what they wanted this system for was not for the benefit of the banks. They tell you, of course, that this strengthens the banking system so you won't have bank failures. Well, the fact is there have been more bank failures since we adopted the Federal Reserve System than there have been in all recorded history before that time. Between 1913, when they adopted the Federal Reserve Act, and May of 1929, that's before the crash came. That didn't come till October, you remember, of 29. But from 1913 to May 1929, under the Federal Reserve System, mind you, there were 4,500 bank failures in the United States. And you know, of course, how they crashed on a wholesale scale under the Roosevelt administration, another Marano Jew. Now, what they created this system for was to take over the right to issue money. There is no more excuse for any banking institution having the right to issue money than there is for any private organization taking over the entire Defense Department and having the right to determine whether we fight for our liberty or whether we surrender and let ourselves be butchered. It's a government function, pure and simple, and totally indefensible that you turn it over to any private organization. And if you say, well, what has this got to do with religion and the law of God? I'm going to point out to you before we're through the laws of God we violated, but I want you to learn the consequences of violating those laws. Now, they succeeded in putting over on the gullible and the stupid the statement, if the government issues its own money, other than metallic coinage, which is valuable for the gold or silver in it, if the government puts out its own paper money, that's inflationary, because there's nothing behind it as security for it except the good faith of the government and its taxing power. In other words, if you want to turn your paper money into gold to go abroad and buy things there where they may not take your paper money, you have the good faith of the government and its ability to raise money by taxation as a guarantee they'll redeem your paper money. But they say now, bankers' money is different. It's not inflationary because it has security back of it. It has government bonds back of it. Well, let's see just what there is. Let's take the way it works under theory of the Federal Reserve Act, and we'll see they don't even live up to their own theory. The Treasury Department has $1 billion in U.S. government bonds, and the Federal Reserve Bank has $1 billion in money. This is theory. So the Federal Reserve Bank takes the $1 billion in money to the Treasury, and they buy the $1 billion worth of bonds with it. And up to that point, it looks all even, doesn't it? But according to the Federal Reserve Act, The Federal Reserve Bank gets back their entire $1 billion, and they own $1 billion of government bonds without having paid 1 copper cent for them. And that's by their own theory. Well, in a sense, they have paid a copper cent. The government charges them the actual cost of printing your paper money. They pay $1.25 per 1,000 bills. If it's 1,001 bills, they pay $1.25 for it, and I'd like to be able to do that. And if it's 1,000 $10,000 bills, so that's $10 million, they pay $1.25 for that. And wouldn't I like that privilege? But they say now, we won't demand that we take the bonds and put them in the bank vault. We leave them in the vaults of the Treasury Department as security for the Federal Reserve note money now. Security? A government bond has nothing back of it except the good faith of the government and its ability to raise money to pay it off by taxing you poor suckers, the taxpayer. And they told us that wasn't enough for the government's money. But there's nothing more than that back of bankers' money. So, government-issued money is no more inflationary than bankers-issued money. But wait a minute, we're just beginning to get into this thing. Still, according to theory, they're the owners of these bonds after they got back their whole $1 billion. And now you and I have to keep paying them every year the interest on the bonds that didn't cost them anything. They're getting interest on that $1 billion now that they didn't put into it. And then eventually the bonds mature after they've had nearly that $1 billion in interest, and then we pay them another $1 billion to redeem the bonds when they come due. And you haven't even heard the worst of it yet. As I said, according to theory, they first have to trot to the Treasury Department with $1 million in money to buy those bonds. Well, they don't do it. Some of you remember the infamous days of the Roosevelt New Deal administration, and you remember that an important man in the New Deal policy making in those days was Mr. Mariner Eccles. And among other things, they put him on the board of governors of the Federal Reserve Bank system. So he knew from the inside what was going on. And he testified under oath before a congressional investigating committee that they do not pay money to the federal government to buy the bonds. He said, we just create it by an entry in our books. In other words, all they do in the ledgers of the Federal Reserve Bank, they devote a page to the United States government and they write down the figure 1 followed by 9 zeros, and the little drop of ink it takes to write that is their total investment in the purchase of $1 billion worth of bonds. And now this doesn't happen once with $1 billion, it happens over and over and over and over. Now it's true that the government gets to draw on that account like you would if you borrowed money from the bank and they gave you a passbook with figures written in it. But the government takes it out in driblets during the year. The bank has the use of that money a large part of the year, and they are using it, lending it out. Now, if they lend $1 to 10 different people at the same time, which is standard banking practice, and they charge each one, let's say only 6% interest a year, 6% 10 times equals 60% a year on the $1, doesn't it? And that's what they're getting out of it. Oh, they didn't stop with that. I said you hadn't heard the worst of it yet. Now, the way many business transactions are financed is this. Let's say you're a merchant, and you order a carload of goods from the manufacturer. In some instances, you buy on open account. You don't pay in advance. He ships them to you and bills you, And as a general rule, payment within 30 days is regarded as cash and gets a 2% discount. And if you don't pay within 30 days, you pay the full amount, and if you take 60 or 90 days or more, why, you begin paying him a little interest on it. But maybe he wants his money quicker than that. So, you send your signed promissory note or contract to the manufacturer for the amount of your purchase. And if he endorses it, so he guarantees the payment of it, he can take it to the bank and sell it to the bank. Now, the bank usually doesn't give him full value on it. Your note for $1,000, perhaps the bank gives him 85, 90%. He's willing to take a discount in order to get his money right now. He's made up for that by raising the price to you a little. And the bank is getting interest on $1,000 when the bank only has an $850 or $900 investment in it. The bank is willing. They're not taking chances just on your solvency. They've got the manufacturer's signature on it too, guaranteeing the payment. Now, that paper is called a trade acceptance, and the banks get a lot of them. So the Federal Reserve law provided that if the Federal Reserve Bank used U.S. government bonds as security, they got back Federal Reserve notes equal to 100 cents on the dollar. If they used trade acceptances, they would get Federal Reserve notes equal to not more than 90 cents on the dollar. So maybe these things got paid off, maybe they didn't, but in the meantime, the Federal Reserve Bank was getting back its money, which they were putting out again 10 times over at interest, and all the time drawing interest from the federal government on the bonds that didn't actually cost them anything but $1.25 per thousand bills. Now look what a complete control over your entire economic life the Federal Reserve Bank has. In the first place, they can bring your local bank business grinding to a halt anytime they want to. Remember reading a little while back in the papers that they thought we were getting a little too prosperous and it was time to slow down the economy. So the Federal Bank raised the rediscount rate. Now, I told you the local bank, to keep its money supply available, has to be able to cash in someplace a lot of these mortgages and so forth and notes that they have on hand. They take them to the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Federal Reserve Bank accepts them and gives them back money for it, but it charges them this discount rate. And by raising the discount rate to the point where your bank cannot pay that and still be able to lend the money to you at a rate you can afford to pay, they in effect shut off the supply of money, without which the business of the community cannot be conducted. Of course, they can refuse absolutely, but they don't have to. They can do what they have done sometimes in the past, and that is just raise the discount rate to an impossible figure. In 1920, they decided to break the farmer. Farmers are an independent lot, you know. During World War I, the farmers were encouraged to raise as much wheat as possible and buy more land for that purpose. And the government kept telling them it was their patriotic duty to do it, and we'll see that money is made easy to borrow, to buy it with, and so on. So the farmer mortgaged the land he already had, plus the land he was going to buy, to raise the money to buy it. And he did it through his little local small-town bank. And these banks were not under the thumb of the Federal Reserve Bank. They were an independent local bank. And then, of course, during World War I, the factories had been so busy and the workmen drawing high pay that there was a lot of money put out into circulation. 2 times during its existence, the Federal Reserve Bank has allowed the supply of money to be expanded so the community could do business, World War I and World War II. Otherwise than that, they have shut the money supply down to the point where not money but credit was the only thing available to do business on, and that gave them that stranglehold on your windpipe against which you had no defense. So it was time to take back all this money that was out in circulation, time to drive the farmer off his land, and labor in the city was getting pretty independent. The unions were getting strong. Time to break them, too, by giving them the competition of all these farmers driven off the farm, desperate to get a job in the city at anything, any pay they could get for it. So they brought on the Depression of 1921 by simply shutting off the supply of money for agricultural operations and farm loans. Yes, it drove most of the small town banks out of business, broke an awful lot of them, leaving the banking system of the country largely in the hands of this one sinister corporation, the Federal Reserve Bank system. But now let's go back a little bit earlier than this. You haven't heard the worst of it yet. I've been giving this to you gradually so you could stand the shock. Why did we have the Federal Reserve Bank system at all? You can go back and read the leading magazines from around 1900 on and find what I'm telling you now in it. Some people were worried about the possibility of the outbreak of a large-scale war in Europe because so many nations were maintaining big armies and navies, and there was bitter trade rivalry between Jew-dominated England and Germany, and they were afraid it was going to break out in war. But you found that all the leading economists said it can't. War is impossible because the nations of Europe can't finance a war. So, in order to get the Christians to killing each other and destroying each other's nations for the benefit of the Jews, and in order to pour billions of dollars into the coffers of the big Jew banking houses, it was necessary to bring about a war and to find a means of financing it. And the European branches of the House of Rothschild were capable of financing one side of that war, but not both sides. So they had to mobilize the financial resources of the United States to finance the other side. Otherwise, no war. They held off their war till they got the Federal Reserve System set up in this country in 1913, then they could start their war in 1914. Now the big banking houses affiliated with the House of Rothschild, like J.P. Morgan and Company, Kuhn Loeb and Company, they bought enormous issues of British bonds. And they were able to get the money to buy them with, British and French, through the Federal Reserve System. But it began to look as though Britain and France would lose the war and be unable to pay off the big Jew banks on these bonds. And there was no way they could get the United States government to pay off French and British bonds except to get the United States into the war. Some of you are old enough to remember this. Woodrow Wilson ran for his second term upon the platform, "He kept us out of war," remember, 1916? And he had already pledged to get us into the war. That was his definite commitment to the Jew bankers who put up the money to elect him and who owned him. Yeah, that's characteristic of these Democrats, saviors of the people. Remember Franklin D. Roosevelt? "I hate war. I promise you, as I have said over and over, your sons will never be sent overseas to fight a foreign war." And he already had sold you out and made the commitment to get us into the war. Yeah. Characteristic of the Democrat Party. Well, They got us into the war. We financed the entire Allied side of the thing. And, of course, the big Jewish banking houses made a great many billions out of it. Out of the monies of Kuhn-Loeb and Company, chiefly through Jacob Schiff, some $20 million were sent to Russia to finance the communist revolution there, as all of you know. But they found that they hadn't totally destroyed the Christian powers, and they had to have a Second World War to do that. So they got the Second World War, which almost finished it. And now they're getting ready for the Third World War to complete the job. So this is the octopus which has this stranglehold upon your financial system. You know, in 1913, the Federal Reserve System was started with $143 million. That's all the stockholders paid into it. And its assets today exceed $54 billion, which all came directly or indirectly out of you poor suckers, the taxpayer. Now let's see where this has been bringing us. You know, God promised us we'd have prosperity if we obeyed His law. During the last 100 years, the federal tax rate per capita, I'm not talking about state taxes, county, city, anything but U.S. government taxes, but the average tax per person, and that includes the baby still in diapers as well as those who are old enough to earn the money to pay taxes, the average federal tax per capita a year ago was $8.49 a year. Today it is $654.74 per person. For an average family of 5, that is $3,273.70 a year. And that's only federal taxes, remember. The average family of 5 does not have a $10,000 a year income, so they are paying substantially over 32% of their income, and there is no known instance in history where any nation survived long after taxes passed the 30% mark. And federal taxes alone are beyond that. And if you say my income tax isn't that high, the point is your income tax is only part of it. A large part of the federal tax system consists of excise taxes collected from the manufacturers, so they become a part of the price of the goods he sells. When you buy a loaf of bread, you are paying not only for the cost of the wheat and the labor to mill it and bake it and so on, but you are paying 14 different taxes that have been levied on that from the time it was growing on the farmer's land till the time you get it in the store. There's very little you can buy today that somewhere or other hasn't picked up some federal excise taxes on it. And that's what brings it up to this level. You don't see them as taxes, and therefore you're not conscious of how much tax you're paying. You just say the cost of living is going up so much because look how much the merchant charges me. He does it because in order to buy the goods to put on his shelves, he has to pay the cost of the goods plus all the accumulated excise taxes on the way down. Then on top of that, of course, you get your state and local sales tax. Now let's see what... all of our own expenses, plus nearly all the expenses of the Allied side against Germany. The total public debt was $259 billion, $115 million. At the end of 1948, even under Harry Truman, we had reduced the debt down to $252,366 million. At the end of 1960, after the Korean War, it was up to $286,471 million. And at the end of 1967, our present law sets a debt limit for the United States, bonded debt, of $358 billion, but you remember they got through Congress some months ago approval of an additional $7 billion because they said we would be over the $358 billion mark before the end of the fiscal year. And the government was going to have to stop paying its bills unless they could get more money by selling more government bonds. Remember now, the Federal Reserve Bank is not the only one who holds government bonds and gets interest on them. But the Federal Reserve System is the only one who can buy government bonds for nothing and get interest on them, in addition to getting the principal paid back to them too. Now let's look at the government budget, what the government pays out. In 1915, our budget was $746 million, and it included pretty heavy expenditures that Woodrow Wilson was having made, getting us rearmed, ready to get into World War I. Up to that time, we never had had a billion-dollar budget. $1 billion. In 1935, in the midst of the Roosevelt spending mania, our budget has risen to $6,497,000,000. I've left out the World War II years because you'd expect it to be high, paying all the expense practically of one side of the war. In 1940, our annual budget, now this is all government expenses for everything, was $9,055,000,000, and that included Roosevelt's feverish arming, getting ready to get into World War II. I'm impressing you with this figure. Less than $10 billion for the grand total of all government expenses, including building up an enormous Navy and Air Force. Because I want you to compare that with the fact that last year we paid $13.5 billion just for interest on the public debt alone, and the coming year's budget includes $14,152,000,000 just for interest alone. And President Johnson says our total budget for the year has to be $186 billion. Now does something begin to dawn on you? When we fought World War II to destroy Christian civilization in Europe, we didn't pull our punches. We didn't say anything about not wanting to win the war, just to get them to the bargaining table. We didn't have any pious platitudes about not bombing the enemy's factories because they were in cities where somebody lived. You know, the worst things that Hitler was ever accused of, and they were lies, weren't half as bad as what we did as a matter of government policy. We talked about unconditional surrender of Germany as our only policy. We deliberately bombed the residence areas of German cities where there wasn't a factory and there wasn't an anti-aircraft gun or anything else to make it a legitimate target. And in Hamburg and in Dresden, we turned the whole city into one sheet of flame, deliberately burning to death the civilian population of women and children and civilian men. And now we're too noble to bomb Hanoi, lest perhaps some one of the commies get hurt in the process. What's the difference? We kept the Korean War going year after year when we had the power to win it in a month. Every general in command in Korea, when he came back, testified before Congress. He could have won it crushingly in a brief period, and he wasn't allowed to do so. Not just MacArthur. Everyone else who had command in Korea gave the same testimony. Look at the war going on now in Vietnam. It's been going on for years, and we're feeding the best youth of the nation into the meat grinder, destroying our breeding stock. Our own government has officially declared that they see no prospect for ending this thing in less than 25 years. It isn't just your sons who are going to be murdered by the treachery and betrayal of your own government. It's your grandsons, and they won't even start a new war to do it. They'll be murdering them in the same old one in Korea. We could win this thing till no communist would dare speak a word in opposition to it, and we could do it in 3 weeks with the weapons we have. Remember, through Johnson, through Dean Rusk, we have said it is not our policy to win the war in Korea. Through Mr. Goldberg, our ambassador to the UN, we said we don't want to win the war, we just want to bring them to the bargaining table. And for that, they are butchering your sons over there, forbidding them to win the war. And are you beginning to wonder now why the Koreans, after we have told them, we could win this for you in 3 weeks, but we're going to be here devastating your land with continuous warfare and having your sons killed along with ours for 25 years, the Vietnamese, I should say. Are you wondering why the South Vietnamese are beginning to say now we could get better terms than that from the commies? Now, why are they doing it? Let's go back to the Federal Reserve System again. We spent more money on the Korean War year for year than we did on World War II. We're spending more money year for year on the Vietnam fiasco than we did in World War II. And how we're managing to spend it without getting any results is one of the unexplained mysteries of the age, because they don't have enough weapons and they don't have enough ammunition, and they've explained to us that because they don't have bombs enough to load the airplanes up with a full load, they have to send them out with only a quarter load, therefore every pilot has to fly through that anti-aircraft fire 4 times in order to deliver one normal bomb load. They're having to strip Europe of the materials we had there supposedly for the defense of Europe. They pretty much stripped Europe of helicopters to send them to Vietnam because Mr. McNamara saw to it we didn't have enough. We ran out of bombs and we had to get a lot of them from Europe. You've heard of the troubles we've had. You've heard of our soldiers there writing back in desperation, asking their parents here to buy them a cleaning rod for the rifle and mail it to them because the government didn't have any to issue them. Oh yeah, that's Mr. McNamara's triumph. As Roosevelt used to say, we planned it that way. But somehow the money got spent, and nobody knows where the money went. And because we were spending so much more than taxation could provide, we had to keep issuing bonds and asking the Federal Reserve System to buy them, and then giving the Federal Reserve System the money to buy them with. And we won't be selling so many bonds, or rather giving so many bonds to the Federal Reserve System anytime the war ends. Now, can you add 2 and 2 together and arrive at some number a little short of 11 as the proper total? This is what happens when you turn your back on God. The laws of God are natural laws as much so as the law of gravity, and they're every bit as self-enforcing. I've told you this before, and I'm going to tell it to you again because I want to impress it on you. If you jump out of an 8-story window, you do not violate the law of gravity. You obey it. You come down. You obey it the hard way and you pay the penalty. If you ride down in the elevator, you obey it the easy way and you get the benefit. And every law of God, his economic laws, like the dietary laws and all these others, are just as much natural laws as the law of gravity, and they enforce themselves with the same bitter penalty. The wages of sin are death. And your sons are dying over there in the mud in Vietnam because you here in this country allow the laws of God to be violated. Remember, he said, if you obey his laws, 5 of you shall chase 100 of the enemy, and 100 of you shall put 10,000 to flight. You'd win your wars crushingly with no loss to yourself. But remember, he also said, you are my battle axe and weapons of war. For with thee will I overthrow nations, and with thee will I destroy kingdoms, which means you've got to do that job. You have a choice. Do it in obedience to God's law, and do it with little monetary cost and very little loss of life, or do it violating God's law and pay the heavy, bitter penalty. But you've got to do it anyway. All right. We allowed these men, and you know what Jews want to do to Christian civilization. I don't have to give you an hour's sermon on that. You've surely learned that by now. We allowed these men to get this power over us. God told us in the first place never to let a Jew live in our land. And I'll say this for Hitler. He wasn't doing anything wrong at all. He was obeying the law of God when he started cleaning them out of Germany. Do you know why we got into World War II against Germany? It wasn't because of fictitious atrocities. Those were used as a propaganda justification afterward. He didn't have any Jews in concentration camps till after the war was going. After the war was going, he rounded up these commie Jew enemies and he put them in concentration camps. And if that's so terrible, what did we do to the Japanese here in California and a lot of the Germans all over the United States after we got into war? We did the very same thing. But all during the time when the Jews were running around loose in Germany and they were getting out, and the Jews were trying to make up their mind whether they were going to later charge that Hitler killed 10 times as many Jews as there were in all Europe, or just 10 times as many Jews as there were in Germany. They were getting us into the war, and Roosevelt was pledged to them to enter it. And the only reason was that Hitler saw what the Jew economic system and banking system had done to Germany, and he was breaking their power. Now, Germany is a nation which, like England, does not raise within its own borders all the things that it needs in the way of raw materials. They have to import some raw materials, and to buy them, they have to export some of their finished products. That's the way Britain has been doing for a century and a half, and Germany was having to do it. So as a means of strangling Germany and destroying her economically, the Jews started a worldwide boycott of German exports. And you know how the Jews control commerce in all the nations of the world. It was a declaration of war, as Samuel Untermeyer himself said. They had declared a holy war against Germany, and that they were conducting here in the United States during all the years before any war broke out in Europe. Hitler was starting to put into operation some of the laws of God, and he was proving that in spite of this Jew boycott, Germany could and was becoming prosperous. Against all the efforts of the devil's children to strangle and destroy her, Germany was becoming prosperous by going back to the economic laws of God. And that had to be destroyed no matter how many Christians were butchered to do it. That's why we got into World War II. Woodrow Wilson himself, along in 1919, testified before Congress, Congressional Committee. He said the basic cause of the World War I was economic rivalry. You remember we were told it was all those phony atrocities that the Germans didn't commit. Woodrow Wilson said the cause was just economic rivalry. So they asked him point blank, do you believe that if Germany had never committed any atrocity nor anything that we could call an act of war against us, that we would have gone to war against Germany anyway? And he said, yes, I do believe it. And if Franklin D. Roosevelt had ever spoken a truthful word in his life, he could have testified to the same thing about World War II. All right. What should we have done? The taking of interest, which in your King James Version Bible is called usury, is forbidden in the Bible. Now today we say, well, of course, interest above a certain rate, 42% a year for a pawnbroker, for example. When it gets above that, it's usury, but below that, it's not. The meaning of the word usury is anything paid for the use of something which has been loaned. And if it is a billionth of 1% a century, it's still usury. Now, Exodus 22, verse 25. If thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. Leviticus 25, verses 35 to 37. And if thy brother be waxen poor, and fallen in decay with thee, then thou shalt relieve him, yea, though he be a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with thee. Take thou no usury of him, nor increase, but fear thy God, that thy brother may live with thee. And thou shalt not give him thy money upon usury, nor lend him thy victuals for increase. It didn't matter whether you loaned him the food to eat or the money to buy it. You could make no charge for the loan. Deuteronomy 23, verses 19 to 20. Now remember, all this has been the matter of loans between those who are your fellow Israelites. It was not the intention of God that all the other races who hate you should come in and enrich themselves at your expense by borrowing from you and paying you nothing for it. Deuteronomy 23, verses 19 and 20. Thou shalt not lend upon usury to thy brother, usury of money, usury of victuals, usury of anything that is lent upon usury, unto a stranger, and here the word is the Hebrew word nukri, an alien of another race. Unto a stranger thou mayest lend upon usury, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon usury. Now there's one other thing. We admittedly have a U.S. public debt, bonded debt, around $358 billion, fluctuating a little above it and a little below it. But that isn't all the United States public debt. That's only the bonded part of it. And remember now, we're not talking about your state bond issues and your county bond issues and your city bond issues and your irrigation district bond issues and the rest of them. This is just federal government debt. We have a vast horde of federal government civil service employees who have the right to retire after a while upon their civil service pension. And while a certain amount of that is deducted from their wages while they work, the U.S. government has to put in its part too. And the government owes it to these people when they retire to pay them their pension the rest of their lives. So the money the federal government is going to have to put in to pay that pension is a government debt just as truly as a debt for which they issued a bond. The same thing is true of the military retirement pensions. Then look at Social Security. The government is having to pay a heavy share of what the man on Social Security is going to get during the rest of his life. Now, when you add those things into the recognized debt from U.S. bonds and U.S. notes, you get a total federal debt of $1 trillion. Not billion, trillion. Obviously unpayable. And when all this comes due and we can't pay it, what's going to happen to our economic system? Remember why God warned us not to get into this trap in the first place, and then said to come out of this Babylonian system, lest ye be partaker of her sins and ye receive of her plagues. We thought we were smarter than God. We aren't. We're just greedier, that's all. And our greed. You know, the only thing that gets a mouse into that trap to get caught is his greed to get that piece of cheese it's baited with. And we aren't a bit smarter than the mouse either. It's one of the things we inherited from Adam. We do breed true to type. Under the laws of God, the burden of unpayable debts had to be relieved. Now, if you borrowed anything, you were under a moral obligation to do everything you reasonably could to pay it off. It wasn't simply a means whereby you could fleece your creditors. But there would be, for many people, a situation where the debt had become unpayable. Things hadn't worked out well and they couldn't pay it off. And so every 7th year, the burden of unpayable debt was to be released. Deuteronomy 15, verses 1 to 3. At the end of every 7 years, thou shalt make a release, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lendeth aught unto his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or of his brother, because it is called Yahweh's release. Of a foreigner, again that's that nokri, that alien, of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again, but that which is thine with thy brother, thine hand shall release. And God promised, if you will do this, he said, I will give you such prosperity that you will be better off having canceled the debt than you would have been had you required payment of it. And you note that 7-year rhythm. Now, we haven't been willing to follow that law voluntarily, but as I said, you obey the law of God involuntarily while you're getting the penalty if you won't obey it voluntarily and get the benefit. Now, an unpayable debt can be canceled involuntarily. Your debtor may go through bankruptcy in federal court and get his release in bankruptcy. Or, without that, he's broke. There's no point in your spending good money after bad on a lawsuit when he hasn't got anything you can collect out of. So time passes until the statute of limitations period runs, and you can't sue him. The time is up. So his debt is canceled just as effectively as it would have been by bankruptcy. Now, a while back, whenever the bankers precipitated a disaster by calling in the money supply, shutting off credit, we used to call it a panic. Then after they got us organized under the Democrats so it was to be perpetual, you can't stay in a state of panic for an entire generation or more, so they changed the name and they called it a depression, but it's the same thing. Now, I haven't bothered tracing these back the last couple of thousand years, but let's go back here as far as any of the oldest of us can remember, and note the timing. 1893, 1900, 1907. The next was due in 1914, and disastrous symptoms of it were showing up in 1913. But remember, they had 1914 set as the year for their war, and they had to keep from putting us into disaster if we were going to finance the war that was to destroy Christian civilization. So they staved it off. And by selling the British war supplies at highly inflated prices, getting profits to the big Jew-owned corporations, we were able to pay big wages to the men who worked in those plants and we had a phony prosperity. You know how rich you can get killing people and destroying cities and so on? Well, we thought we did. All right, still keeping the 7-year rhythm. The next one was due in 1921, and it came on schedule. And incidentally, the Federal Reserve Bank brought it on. 1928, the next one was due, and it had already hit in Europe in 1928. Well, we kidded ourselves out of it until 1929 here. We were already having trouble. Unemployment was at a high rate, and all the danger signals were out. But look at all the corporation stocks we'd bought, paying 5 times as much as they were worth, and surely there would be some sucker around to buy them from us pretty soon for 10 times what they were worth. So we were getting rich, weren't we? And then the crash came and we weren't getting rich at all. Okay, 1935 was the next time it was due on a 7-year cycle. And in the midst of the Roosevelt Depression, there was a low spot, too, in 1935. 1942 was the next time it was due. But remember now, they had to keep us prosperous so we could complete the destruction of Christian civilization and make certain that the laws of God would never be put into effect by any nation, to give an example the way Germany was doing. So they gave us again some artificial war prosperity. Remember how rich we got by issuing all those bonds to the Jews who didn't have the money to pay for them anyway? Or did we get rich? Now we're having to pay for those bonds out of our own pocket, remember. 1949, it was due again, and we had a low spot then, too. 1956, it was due again, and we had a low spot in the economy. 1963, it was due again, and we had a low spot in the economy. And there's another one due by 1970. Do the laws of God work, or don't they? Isn't it just possible now that the Creator of the universe and everything in it knows what His own laws will do? And isn't it time that we got wise to this and decided to obey it? It's high time, now that we see what's happening to Babylon's money. Remember now, you don't have any government money from the size of $1 up. Oh, you've got these phony copper sandwich coins. You've got a debased 50-cent piece. It's peculiarly appropriate that Kennedy's picture be on it. And you've got your quarters and dimes of a copper sandwich. And no nation in history has ever yet been able to debase its coinage and escape the consequences that it became worth less. Inflation, we like to call it. But you can't get a paper dollar that's anything but Babylon's money, the Federal Reserve note. You don't have any government money. It's bank money. Now, when more money is needed for the economy to function, the government cannot issue it. The government goes in debt to the banks. The banks issue the money for their own profit. Well, anytime they want to pull the plug on this thing, our economy goes down the drain, which is what they know, what they plan. It will be part of the general attack. They will use this just before they spring the military attack upon us, because with financial disaster comes the closing of the factories and the throwing out into the streets of millions of unemployed people who can be led into riots and revolution like the Negroes. And they can tell us you can't finance your own defense because you're broke and you're in a depression. First they took all our gold. Now they've taken our silver. They've left us with paper, and when they laugh at us and say, all right, it's the IOU of a private banking corporation, and we don't have anything to pay you with but more paper IOUs, what are you going to spend it on, and who are you going to buy something from? Who's going to take it? We've got all the gold and we've got all the silver. That's what they plan to tell us. Well, Ezekiel 7 verse 19 says, they shall cast their silver in the streets, and their gold shall be removed. Their silver and their gold shall not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of Yahweh. They shall not satisfy their souls, neither fill their bowels, because it is the stumbling block of their iniquity. And James 5, verse 3, your gold and your silver is cankered, and the rust of them shall be a witness against you. You know, something that's kept in use is not the thing that rusts. It's the thing that's set away idle that rusts out. And they are taking the gold and the silver away so it cannot be used as our money, and using it to destroy us. And God says, the rust of them shall be a witness against you, and shall eat your flesh as it were fire. Ye have heaped treasure together for the last days. Yes, the Bible reveals that these children of the devil are coming to their final doom for having done this. But remember, as long as we're in the same boat with them, the process of sinking that boat is going to be rough on us too. Isn't it about time that we came out of the Babylonian system, and you can't get out of any of it until you get out of the system of Babylon's money?